everyone. I'm Rachael Maves, and you're listening to Getting Real with Leaders in Education, where we strip away the layers and get to the raw, unfiltered stories behind the leaders shaping the future of education. My guest today is Gloria Corral, President and CEO of Parent Institute for Quality Education, or PIQE. PIQE is a national organization providing families with the knowledge and skills essential to actively engage in their children's education and to strengthen parent, school, community partnership and collaboration. PIQE provides empowering information, skills development, and support systems for communities of color, multilingual learners, immigrant, and low-income families. This family engagement empowerment model has benefited approximately 1.5 million children in its 32-year history. Prior to Parent Institute for Quality Education, Gloria served as the Assistant Executive Director at First Five San Diego, Deputy Director at First Five San Francisco, and Co-Director of Policy and Outreach at Preschool California. Gloria, thank you for joining me today at the Getting Real with Educational Leaders podcast.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. It's an honor to be here and to spend time with you.
Yeah, it's so good to catch up with you and to reconnect and hear about the great work that's happening at PIQE. Today, I want to hear a little bit, I think, on the personal side for you. Why did you choose education with everything that you had before you and the choices and the opportunities? Why education?
It's a way of how I see the world. My story in so many ways is the story really of the American dream my parents had for us. My family's from Mexico. My parents immigrated to Tijuana, which is the melting pot of so many who come wanting to come to the US. And my mom was a teacher in her small town because she had been able to go to middle school. And back then in Mexico, being a middle school graduate meant you were the most educated person in, 100-mile radius. And so when we came to this country, my parents and all they knew was that getting an education was the way for all of us to thrive and to really seize opportunities that were made available in this country. And so I remember my first day of school. There's four of us, four children. My mom walked us to our elementary school, which was a few blocks from our house. She stopped across the street from the elementary school and she said two things. Pórtate bien y hazle caso a la maestra. Behave and listen to your teacher. And then she sent us into the class, into the school. None of us, my brother was a first grader. I was a third grader. My other brother was a fourth grader. We didn't know a word of English. And really my mom's experience with education was one where she trusted that teachers would care for us, right? Mm-hmm. And that they knew what was best for us. And so I think for me, that love and that responsibility of nurturing a child's well-being, of welcoming families, left obviously a very big impression. And so I've dedicated my life, quite frankly, professionally and personally, to making those opportunities available to children and families, because I actually really believe that education really is a pathway for not just economic mobility, importantly economic mobility, but I think also to enable every child's innate magnificentness to thrive, right? And that parents' ability and dreams for their children can be realized through a strong, loving, rigorous educational experience. It really can. And so I feel like if I can contribute to that journey in some way, big or small, then I've honored my parents and I think I can leave the world a better place.
I love that. And I love hearing too what you said about your mom trusting that the school and the adults in the system were going to meet you guys' needs and take care of whatever was happening within your education. And my guess is that is something that drives you at PIQE. So tell me a little bit about how you went toward that focus, because that really is your focus, is the parental involvement and how do we engage families in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it's because I really believe that I have yet to meet a parent or a loving adult who doesn't want what's best for their children. I've never met them. And listen, I've traveled across the country. I've worked in DC, I've worked in Sacramento, in San Francisco and San Diego. I've never met an adult, a parent, a grandmother, a tia, an auntie who doesn't want a better future for their children. And the work that we do at PIQE is, as you said, like to do three things. One, give families the information they need to understand the education system. That's
Yeah.
critical. For so many families, the education system hasn't worked for them. Whether they've dropped out, whether they left unprepared to do to get a job, to go to higher ed. So we provide families information. We help them develop skills. What that means is actually learning how the system works, where they can impact it, how to impact it by reaching out to a principal. What's the difference between a principal and a counselor? Why does the vice principal deal with some issues versus a psychologist? So we talk to families about how you engage in this country in the education system. And then third, and it's so critical, especially for the families we serve, Rachel, is that we build a sense of community and sense of self-efficacy, meaning that in a lot of communities, especially if you are immigrant, if you don't speak English as a first language, or if the education system has failed you and you've been in this country, 100 years, it's that sense of isolation, that you don't have a voice, that what you feel is something nobody else feels, that your dreams for your children are different from the dreams of the children next to you. So we very intentionally build that sense of community because our work leads families into action. Now, we don't tell parents or families what that action should be. We believe that if you give people information, you give them skills, you give them a sense of self-efficacy, they will determine what is the best right step for them and their children. Whether that's setting up a meeting with their teacher, whether that's going and advocating for services at the district, whether it's writing their congressperson. Like, we don't tell them what it is. We say, these are the paths. This is your voice. These are others who can join you and that you're not alone. And let me tell you, the impact that we've had isn't just with that child. This is what's amazing about working with families, is that you change the trajectories of entire communities. That parent won't just advocate for their one child of four, right? They will advocate for all of four children, and not just their children, their neighbors' children, the children, right? Because now they have knowledge, skills, and a sense of self-efficacy that can enable them to do what every parent wants to do, create a better future for their children and for themselves. And so, I think it's because I believe that fundamentally, that this partnership between families, educators, and community, that is the way in which children thrive, communities come together, and actually, as a social justice organization and an educational equity organization, we believe that's our mission, is to change the trajectory by opening opportunities for families, by enabling them to do what's best for them and their children. And it's the collaboration, Rachel, that parents and families want with their educators, with the teachers, with the administrators, and that there are community support and a community that supports and enriches and welcomes them. I believe that's what every child deserves, and that every parent wants, and that's what every educator who wants to be an educator is there to provide.
Yeah, I think, and not in an adversarial way.
That's right.
We're in this together. This is a partnership, and we need everybody's voice at the table because the work is too huge. I mean, it requires the community to support. And this isn't something that was part of the questions, Gloria, but I feel like it's such an important piece to touch on, is the disconnect between, oftentimes, not all the times, but oftentimes, educators and school systems and parents. And what the understanding of the desire for engaging. I mean, can you just speak a little bit about that, of where you see that disconnect and some of the misnomers that we have around how parents want to be engaged?
Absolutely, Rachel. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think there's two things. One is structural. I think what you don't know, right? And if and teacher preparation, right? How do you know about different strategies around decoding? It's because you were taught. There's different ways to teach literacy, right? There's this tool, there's this tool, there's right. And I say that basic in such a basic way because structurally, we don't support aspiring educators to understand what family engagement looks like and
That's
what
right.
tools they might need to pull out of their toolbox, just like when they're teaching literacy, just like when they're teaching numeracy or phonics or whatever, right? Like there are different tools you need to use. So I think part of this is structurally, we aren't supporting our aspiring educators to understand how to engage families effectively. So if you don't know that, right, what is it that you rely on is your preconceptions, it's your own experiences, it's your own biases
Yeah.
that then kind of construct meaning around, a child coming in late or a child falling asleep or someone not coming in to your parent teacher conferences that happen at
That's
2 o'clock, right? Like,
That's right.
so,
Yes.
so it's not understanding that structurally you don't know what you don't know, and therefore we need to support and give educators the tools they need to understand what family engagement looks like and it can look like and what are the tools. I think the second thing, which is in some ways the work that we do in more meaningful ways, I would say, is understanding and helping our educators understand that there are different ways of engaging that are equally valuable and valid. And I'll give you two quick examples. One is that when educators understand, just like my mom, right, where she came with a sense that like me going to talk to a teacher is disrespecting her expertise. So why would I go
Yeah.
in and talk to
That's
a
right.
teacher if she knows best? She's educated, I am not, right? Like, so I think there's sort of a fundamental need for our educators to understand that sense of
Yeah.
where is the family coming from in terms of values, in terms of understanding the system. So I do think there's that. And part of what we do is help families understand that part of the system, right? And what the expectation of the system is vis-a-vis the adult in that child's life, right?
Yeah.
Which is very different than it is in Mexico and parts of Asia, right? So there's that. I think the second really important part to this, Rachel, which your question elicits, is what do I think families should do? And that is predicated on what did you see your parents doing
That's
for
right.
yourself?
Yeah.
What do other people's parents do, right? And I think that that's the part where having strategies really helps. And let me tell you one example that really exemplifies this for me is that oftentimes family engagement in the traditional sense means come to parent conference, parent teacher conferences, come to coffee with the principal if they have it, right? Join a school site council or ELAC or something like that, or volunteer, right? Come into the classroom, do something. So one of our parents in a very rural part of the state basically told one of our facilitators, said, can you show me how to make brownies? And it was kind of an interesting question. And so our staff was like, okay, sure, we can talk about that in our lessons. Like our staff was actually thinking about measuring, that maybe that was the issue. Like, let's use this as
Yeah.
a teaching moment for measuring in math, right? And so they said, great, okay, we can talk about it with the rest of the families and we can make this as an activity. And she said, no, I need to learn because the teacher says they need brownies. The mom didn't know what brownies were.
Oh,
Like literally,
geez.
she didn't know what they were
Yeah.
because they don't need it at home.
Yeah.
They don't, right? And
Yeah.
so when again, this is to me such an illustrative point, is because the parent wanted to do what the teacher
Yes.
asked of them, but didn't know what that meant, right? And
Yeah.
so my staff, my team did great. We'll do this. And what ended up happening was that the parents understood that in order to support the teacher, they needed to participate in a bake sale. That was really the end goal for the
Yeah.
teacher, because
Yeah.
that was how the teacher was measuring parent engagement.
Yeah.
And it was one of
Yeah.
those moments where thankfully we were working with the school, right? It enabled a larger conversation with the teachers. right?
Yes.
And the principals. And it really opened up, I think, a bit like a beautiful way of saying food can connect families. And so long story, this parent makes a brownie, but the broader point is that then what the school ended up doing was a kermes, and a kermes is like a potluck, and the moms ended up cooking, and then this became, and they did it at one of their ELAC meetings, and now it's a twice a year tradition that the school
I
and
love
the
that.
parents, there's like 100 parents coming, all because there was a broader understanding of what it meant for the educator and the families to connect with one another, the values and the opportunities that look very different. It wasn't a bake sale, right? It wasn't
Yeah,
at the
that's
parent teacher
right.
conference,
Yes.
but it was like, how can we communicate and validate one another? And there's a million stories like that, because it's about connecting and finding
Yeah.
that you share a very critical common bond, which is the well-being of children.
Well, and I love the example that you gave too, because it provides, I think, such a rich picture of it might start out like as this tiny little seed, but when you value and honor what the community is bringing in and the gifts that they have, how it can flourish into this, I mean, completely different vision, but the engagement is so different. And the connection and the community, it just allows that space for everyone to show up and bring their strengths and their best selves, which
That's right.
is what we need, right, in education right
That's right.
now. So
That's right.
I
And I
wanted,
think, Rachel, and I think the other really important point, I think, for our educators, that they were open. Leadership
yes,
mattered.
yeah, that's right.
Leadership mattered.
Yeah,
So that Kermes was at 5 o'clock. Guess what? Not at 1, because none of the
yeah,
parents were available at 1, right? So again, I just wanted to make the point that there was like an openness and a receptiveness and a willingness to do things differently from the part of the
yeah,
educator. You can
yeah,
have all these things, but if the leadership, if the teacher wasn't willing, if the principal wasn't willing to leave the school open, right, for the custodian to be there, we wouldn't be telling this story.
yeah, that's
And
right.
then the
Yeah,
teacher's takeaway would have been, parents don't care because they didn't
that's
turn
right.
in cookies for
Yes.
the bake sale, even though I told them.
Yeah,
That could be the
yeah,
lesson from here.
yeah, which we hear
That's
often,
right.
unfortunately.
That's
Yeah.
right.
So as we think about, I mean, really some of the persistent issues within education, especially now that we've just gone through this pandemic, what are the two things that keep you up at night?
It's what we hear from families.
Mm,
So we do a community needs assessment of families. We interview families in their home language from across the state of California, and interestingly, very important similarities across the country. And the things that keep me up are two things. One is really, I think, a recognition that the social emotional well-being of children is paramount to, for their well-being, but importantly to academic achievement. And we,
yeah,
I think, are really struggling still to take some of the best practices from early childhood, right? That we think of children's well-being, things like self-regulation, ability to negotiate conflict, uh, because again, teachers aren't like comfortable in those pedagogical approaches, right? To have children when they're 10 come in and do a mood analysis, like, how are you feeling today, right? That's all
yeah,
3-year-olds do that when they walk in, right? Why? Because the teacher can then see how their children, did they wake up well, did they have a tummy ache, right? We somehow forget some of those practices when we're talking about 12-year-olds. I have a 13-year-old. My 13-year-old woke up in a very bad mood this morning, just because he's 13, just for no reason, just because he's 13, right? Like,
yeah,
but we kind of forget some of that. So I think the fact that we still haven't embraced social emotional learning and social emotional well-being as a vital part to academic success
that's
is
right.
really critical, because it has really serious consequences, and families are worried about this. Depression, bullying, school safety, those are issues that families have elevated really, and they start in elementary school, Rachel. And that's
Yeah,
really troubling because of the pandemic, when there was a lot less socializing among children, especially our youngest children. So I think that's one. The second, which is equally important, I'm a huge believer that home language, multilingualism is a huge asset,
mhm,
not because I believe it, it's because
yeah,
that's what the science tells us, that's what the literature says, right? California is a multilingual state. I think it's this other construct, that the otherness of being, right? And I think that what that
Mhm.
means is that we look for otherness. And in a highly diverse state like in California, where 75% of children aren't white, and
Yeah.
and 50% of them speak a language other than English. And right. And so I think that's the other part, is this sense of otherness, that if you're not white, if you're not an English only child, then you are other, when in reality it's the diversity of language, of culture, of experiences that makes California specifically really a thriving place, right? And so
That's
that sort
right.
of that keeps me up at night, because I feel like, as we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, right, these terms that really have become in vogue after the murder of George Floyd and so many others, that we can just stay with the language, with the words, but not the practice, right? And so families
Yeah.
are really feeling this sense of, I don't belong, or people don't think I belong, and my children don't belong. And so I think, to me, this continual focus on otherness, because you look different, because you don't speak English without an accent, or because, right, whatever it might be, really undercuts, I think, the foundational values of this country, which is opportunity, right? That
Mhm.
having a wide set of opportunities made available for everyone is really a belief in the public good, right? Public
Yeah.
libraries, public education, right?
Yeah.
Like public parks, is that we all benefit as a community, as a state, as a country, when we see each other not as other, but as one, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that sense of isolation and that sense of otherness is really troubling for the well-being of a community, of a child. I think, importantly though, Rachel, for our democracy, for the
Yes.
well-being of our state, for the well-being of a country. And that's really concerning to me, because I feel like you're talking about feelings, right? And changing mindsets. And so, as a policy wonk, you can't legislate kindness, you can't legislate
That's
goodwill,
right.
you can't
Yes.
legislate these things,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
that's why it feels very concerning to me, is that each of us then have to make a choice about, is that person that I see an other, or am I seeing that person really as part of my community?
Yeah, that's right. And I love that you keep bringing it back to community, Gloria, because I feel like it's so much in this conversation. It's how do we shift power and move power over other power? And I feel like we're trying to actually propose the wrong thing. It's what does it look like for us to do this in community, where the power structure isn't about who has power over whom, but what does it look like to honor, value, uphold, uplift one another as human beings at that very core, and embrace those differences. And that's it's a different type of conversation. So as you think about all these things, two ways that we could move forward. What are like two really practical ways that we could start to address these issues?
One is to listen. I think being curious and listening, right? Like, it seems so fundamental, but I will tell you, Rachel, going back to the example I gave, like, if we hadn't asked this question of this mom, like, why do you want to learn to bake? Like that, right? Like, we were curious. Like, what?
Brownies.
Like, for us to say, like, no, that's not what we do, right? Like, that could have been our answer, but it wasn't.
Yeah,
It was like, let's be curious, let's listen actively, right? Because that is how you learn. That's how you build community, Rachel. And so I would say, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an educator in any capacity, whether you're an administrator, is to really question with curiosity, and then
yeah,
to listen actively, right? So if you're a principal and you've always done the same thing the same way for the last 3 years, right? Then question that. Why are you doing it, right?
yeah,
Like, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome, right? So
yeah,
if you're thinking, these families are hard to reach, these children can't read, like, and you're still doing the same thing, question, be curious. What about this can you revisit? And then
yeah,
bring in different people, to inform you, right? To listen actively and say, like, we've never asked these questions, or we've never asked these 3 teachers that don't show up to staff meetings. Let me come up with
Yeah.
a different strategy to listen to their point of view. So I would say actively listen and be curious about what it is that you are doing as a professional is critical.
Mhm.
I think the second thing that I would invite others to think about, especially when it comes to engaging families, but I think more broadly, is how is it that you're thinking about building community? And that's very different than what
Yeah,
parent engagement activities are you doing? It's
that's
like,
right.
those are
Yes.
2 different questions. And so I always
Yes.
want to, like, so what is it that you are doing as a leader in the school, as a teacher in the school, as a colleague or a CBO partner in the school to build community? And what that means, Rachel, is to look around. Who isn't at the table? Where's your federally qualified health centers, right? What about your before school and after school providers? Where are your family childcare providers in the neighborhood, right? Where
Yeah.
are your corporate, your liquor store, if that's what you have, right? Because in some communities that's all you have. Your grocery stores, your food bank, right? Where are they?
Yeah.
Really to build community. And then where are you in relationship to them? Are you
Yeah.
showing up to the public library? Are you showing up to the festival that everyone attends? Are you going to the park where the kids hang out, right? Again, the list is endless, but I would say, like, the strategies around building community actually means identifying who's not at the table and reaching out to them, not once, not twice, but in an ongoing way, because that's how you build community. And then where are you in relationship to them? Where and how are you being present for those families and
Yeah.
those communities, right? And then I would say, like, don't think that because we're no longer in the pandemic that the digital divide has closed, that, right,
That's
the
right.
digital equity
Yes,
is no longer
that's
an issue
right.
for families. So I would elevate and invite our colleagues and our partners who are listening to keep some of those best practices that they had to come up with during the pandemic. Home
Yes.
visits, right? Like sending out, messages on Facebook every Sunday night, sending personalized phone calls, right? Keeping your parent engagement or parent liaison staff, keeping the extra hours for your psychologist on staff, right? Like,
Yeah.
these are all things that people were doing in a crisis. I would invite some of us to consider that we are now in a different phase, but those strategies and those practices were actually best practices.
Yeah,
Talking
that's
to
right.
families in multiple ways, in multiple channels, consistently in a language that was accessible to them, in the modality that's accessible to them.
Yeah.
Those are great practices that should continue because the
Yeah.
crisis hasn't subsided. It just looks different,
It
right?
looks different.
It just
Yes.
does.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, as we get ready to wrap up, Gloria, we want to end the podcast with this question because I feel like sometimes we're fixated on the same conversations. And one of the things that I want to draw out, it really is this question of what question in education are we not asking that we really should be?
In some ways, it's my favorite question and my most frustrating question, Rachel, because I will tell you that I still don't understand the question. To me, is what will it take to fundamentally rethink our teacher preparation
Mm,
construct? What will
yeah,
it take? It's not the demographics have changed, so that's not it, right? Like, so it's the most, in some ways, Rachel, the reason why it's so frustrating is because it seems like the most obvious question, and yet it is so entrenched that that's what I continually think about. What will it take for a recognition that the way that we support aspiring educators that are currently in the field, and inviting our young children to want to become educators? And I do say
yeah,
that, Rachel, from early childhood into
yeah,
professorship, right? Like, that continuum of being an educator
yeah,
is really, to me, something that, keeps me up at night, because I really believe that until we decide to change the way we think about our future educators and what is valued and what is taught and who teaches them, and that we talk about, you know, systemic racism, that we talk about proactively dismantling systems of oppression, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. It just means that we need to better understand the communities that make up our education system, that are fundamentally different than they were 150 years ago when our education system began. And so what will it take? Our crisis, our health crisis, made our educators think about engaging families differently. Absolutely, right? So what will it take for our teacher preparation, teacher engagement pipeline to be radically different? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that it's going to need to be answered, I think, strategically, thoughtfully, creatively, so that we have different pathways, whether that's apprenticeship, internships, it's the all and that we teach teachers differently.
That's right.
Different people need to teach people differently, right? And with all due respect to academia, there's a place for that. And then there's a place for lived experience, for being in community, that I think we just need to really rethink that pipeline. And so I'm hopeful that we can, but that's the question that keeps me up.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Gloria. My guest today has been Gloria Corral, President and CEO of Parent Institute for Quality Education. Thank you, Gloria, for joining me today on the Getting Real with Leaders in Education podcast.
It's been an honor, Rachel. Thank you so much.